Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Walljasper along with Tribune football beat writer Dave Matter. Dave, Missouri beats Colorado 26-0 in the Big 12 opener. This now makes 5 games in a row that their defense has played pretty well. In your mind, I know we've made a pact that we're not going to make any pronouncements about the defense before middle of October,
right.
But we're getting there. Do you think we can say, is this defense legit?
Well, I think the evidence is piling up in that direction, and they are improved, I think. One thing they're doing is they're getting a lot of takeaways. That's something they didn't do a year ago. And they have the number 3 scoring defense in the country. So they're doing something right. It reminds me a lot of the 2007 defense. Granted, they went a whole year and played pretty well throughout the schedule, but that defense was really good between the 20s. They didn't let people score, and they got a lot of takeaways. William Moore had all those interceptions, remember, that year. So they're kind of similar to that so far, at least, but I think we're going to know a lot more after these next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, really, if this defense can keep it up. But so far, so good. And they've done it the last 2 weeks without their best player, Alden Smith, who hasn't played with the broken leg, and he may not play again this week. So I think that's got to be pretty promising.
I think they probably only have one NFL guy on that defense, and that's Alden Smith, as compared to, like you were talking about, 2007 when they had 3.
Right.
So I think you have to applaud what they've done so far in that, guys have been coming and going from that lineup, and yet they just kind of keep plugging away with guys you haven't heard a whole lot about. So that's positive. I'm not quite convinced based on, just looking at the players individually, you don't see a lot of game-changing talent over there, though.
Right, but at this point, though, they're going to have to really get blown out to even move down to the middle of the pack in the Big 12. So maybe this is an above-average defense. If they're playing offense a little bit better, then I think that's a good combination. But right now, they're really kind of leaning on that defense to make stops and to get the ball back to the offense and give them more opportunities, which is not really Missouri football the last 5-6 years.
Right, it seems like they're a team that they defend well, they do special teams well, they punt, they end up scoring points based on field position, seems like, which is totally opposite from when Chase Daniel and those guys were here, they could take over their own 10, it didn't really matter.
Right. Maybe Missouri was just spoiled during those years because it got to the point where if Missouri ever punted when Chase Daniel was a quarter, it seemed like this huge failure. Well, if you've got a good punter, if you've got a good defense, it's not the worst thing to happen. But I think there still are some troubling signs with the offense the last few weeks.
Kind of the troubling sign on Saturday was Blaine Gabbert gets hurt. He gets kind of sandwiched on a play at the end of the end of the first half, and kind of you could tell he was not feeling too good. But he plays another quarter before he comes out of the game. It's called a hip pointer, although it almost looks more like it would be a rib situation. I don't know. But anyway, I guess he's supposed to play. But how do you think things will progress this week? James Franklin came in last week and looked pretty good in a short time. Do you think they have a quicker hook maybe than they would have last year when they just sort of left him out there regardless because they didn't feel too confident in his backups?
Any hook last year or any hook this year is quicker than the hook last year because they never really took him out. They did at Texas, but that game was getting out of hand. I think they'll keep him in there. They like his toughness. I think as long as he gets the green light to play, which I think he will, they'll be fine with him back there. You got to wonder how mobile he'll be if that hip locks up. And really, he's not the most mobile guy anyway. And also, will it affect some of his decision-making? Will he be less aggressive? Will he get rid of the ball quicker and not hang in there a little bit longer against the pass rusher? Sometimes, before the pass rush even gets to him. So it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to this. But Franklin's a guy who came in and scored immediately the other night, led a nice touchdown drive. They really like his poise and his just his character. He doesn't seem to get too rattled. But again, playing on the road at Texas A&M for a true freshman is a little different than coming in to a blowout situation at home, in front of your home crowd. So they feel better about the backup situation, I'm sure. But I'm sure they'd rather keep Blaine in there as long as he's upright and able to function.
A little less mobility probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for him. It might convince him to stay in the pocket, like you were talking about.
Right.
He tends to leave the pocket before he needs to. But yeah, with the backup thing, I think people are in love with the idea of Franklin playing quarterback now. But leave him out there for a full game, and I think you would see enough mistakes where people wouldn't be wild with that either. He threw an interception at the end of that game
to a defensive lineman too. Yeah, and Dave Yost, the offensive coordinator, kind of debunked a myth yesterday. We asked him if who's faster between Gabbert and Franklin, and he said Blaine Gabbert is drastically faster than James Franklin. Franklin, though, is just a little bit He's quicker. He's better running through traffic because he's used to doing that. Gabbert is more of a straight line runner who has to be away from defenders to pick up his speed and accelerate. So Franklin doesn't go in there and magically become Brad Smith because he's not that fast. He's not that dynamic of a runner. So it'll be interesting to see if he does get more playing time, if he can show off some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think he's a mobile quarterback, not a running quarterback.
Right, that's a good way to put it, yeah.
Missouri's entering a 4-game stretch now. The previous 5 games, they were double-digit favorites for everyone. Now they're entering a 4-game stretch. They're at A&M, then they're home against Oklahoma, then they're at Nebraska, at Tech. They're probably going to be underdogs in all of them, biggest underdogs against Nebraska. But just your thoughts on what maybe would constitute a successful 4-game stretch here for these guys?
I think 2-2 is good because that means you either win 2 on the road or you beat Oklahoma for the first time under Gary Pinkel. So I don't think there's any way not to be happy with 2-2. And then you set yourself up for maybe a 10-2 finish, because if you can beat 2 of those teams, you can beat everybody else left on the schedule. 3-1 is phenomenal, because then you're beating at least one top 10 team in Oklahoma or Nebraska. I think that's probably unrealistic at this point. Maybe if they were all at home, but they're not. But I think that you don't shoot for 2-2. Obviously, you want to win all of them, but that wouldn't be bad considering how they've played so far up to this point, at least offensively. And you come out of that, and then you've got a real winnable stretch down the road. 3-1 puts you at worst a New Year's Day bowl, because you've got easy games from there on out. But I do think from what we've seen so far, at least offensively, and what we've seen from those other teams, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and A&M at times, that's going to be tough to do.
Yeah, of course, we're kind of making Texas Tech out. They later would go to Iowa State too, which is, Iowa State beat Texas Tech.
Beat Texas Tech,
so
yeah.
I think that's probably an equivalent game, those two. But while there will be underdogs in these games, I think with the exception of the Nebraska game, it's not like they're huge underdogs. I mean, they're basically even, maybe a little bit better team than A&M, I think, and Texas Tech, you could say the same thing.
Right, and this Oklahoma game, and we're getting ahead of ourselves here because they still have to go to A&M, but I think it's very winnable. And Oklahoma is undefeated at this point, but they haven't looked like the Oklahoma teams we saw a few years ago that were competing for BCS titles year in, year out. They have some flaws too, especially on defense. So who knows? I think that's probably the most winnable Oklahoma game that Missouri's played in a couple of years.
I'm going to go off script here. And after the game, did you notice that Gary Pinkel said he threw away his 2-point conversion chart?
Yeah, and Brad Childers should have thrown away his too after last night's Monday night game. But yes, he did. That was interesting.
Now that was interesting because this was the first time that we've really seen a situation where it would have called for it. Because when you look at the chart, when they went ahead 18-0, that was when the 2-point conversion chart would have called for it. He decided not to go for it. This is
you never
turning
know.
over a new leaf.
Maybe Dave Christensen took it to Wyoming with him, and they haven't gotten it back yet.
All right. Lastly, we have viewer mail.
We've got a couple questions here, and I've gotten countless questions in the last few days about whether I think that ESPN College Game Day will come to Columbia next week for the homecoming game when Oklahoma is here. I said probably don't get too ahead of yourself on that one. I think you have to win at Texas A&M first, which is a winnable game for Missouri. Then I think you can start looking at the schedule and thinking maybe that's a possibility. Although game day never has been in Columbia. They like to go to new places. The other games that weekend, Nebraska at Oklahoma State, those could be 2 undefeated teams. LSU at Auburn, the show has already been at Auburn, and then Wisconsin at Iowa. Not a bad game, but they're at Wisconsin this week. So it's a possibility. Let's see what Missouri does this week first.
And you would think they would probably have to win this week for that.
I would think so, yeah. Otherwise, Missouri's not going to be ranked anymore. I don't think they're on a lot of people's ballots. They're still in the low 20s at this point just because of their schedule. One more question here from Sparks J from here in Columbia. Where do you rank this 5-0 Missouri team compared with others in recent memory? I think recent memory would just include the Pinkel era. I don't think yet they're in the same hemisphere as those 07, 08 teams, especially 07, when they were just rolling over everybody that they played, except for when they ran into Oklahoma. But I don't think they're there yet. The defense, like we mentioned earlier, is along the same track as that 07 team. But offensively, that's when the punter could take weeks off at a time because that offense was so dynamic, so explosive. So 07, 08, I think were the 2 best Gary Pinkel teams. I think last year and this year's team, I'm not sure. I looked at the numbers last week and compared them. Defensively, they're kind of similar to where Missouri started last year. As well as the defense has played so far to this point, except for takeaways, they've been close statistically. Offense is the big drop-off.
At this point last year, everybody was in love with Steckel too, and then at the end of the year, when Navy was gashing them, they thought he was a moron.
Things changed a little bit, and Baylor for that matter. So things changed last year in October and November. Offensively, they're a lot more efficient and explosive in September than they were this year. So, somewhere around last year's team and this year's team, I think are fairly similar, but we're going to know a lot more in the next couple weeks.
They did have a little bit better running game, I think. Last year, they've become so kind of anemic running the ball. I think that's going to be their problem going forward, especially on the road.
Yeah, in close games where you're either ahead and you want to just melt the clock away, they just don't have the horses to do that. They've got some good backs, I think, but for whatever reason, against good defenses, which they're going to face here soon, I'm not sure that tailback by committee approach is really going to be good enough for what they want to do.
The other thing is they really have no big play threats when you look at it. I was thinking about this, their best receiver, TJ Moe, if you put him on the 07 team, he's probably Tommy Saunders. I mean, and no knock against him. I mean, I like him as a player, but I mean, they just don't have guys that are going to make big plays, so they got to go down the field incrementally if they're going to do it at all, and they haven't.
And that puts a lot more pressure on Blaine Gabbert to be more accurate too. And I think Chase Daniel could have survived in an offense surrounded by lesser playmakers like that. But I don't know if I don't know if his decision making and his accuracy is good yet to be able to really thrive in an offense where he needs to be that precise every down.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this edition of the show. And next week we will discuss the Texas A&M game and look ahead to the homecoming game against Oklahoma.